looks like a normal summer weekend on Center Hill Lake. WakeFest, music drifting across the marina, boats moving through the dark, people drinking, people moving between campsites and bars, and somewhere in all of that, Lauren Agee starts trying to leave. Not once, repeatedly. She asks people for rides, she looks for somewhere else to stay, and at one point, according to later accounts, she agrees to leave WakeFest entirely, and then somehow, by the end of the night, she is still back on the cliff, back inside of the environment that she increasingly appeared to want to get away from. A remote campsite accessible by canoe, poor to little cell phone service, a hammock suspended near the edge of a steep cliff, and people that she didn't know nearly as well as later narratives sometimes imply. And then, according to one of the people that was there that night, Lauren had mentioned wanting to go home numerous times. And according to that statement, her keys were taken. Now, to be fair, taking somebody's keys if they've been drinking is not automatically sinister. People do it all the time. Sometimes it prevents tragedy, but context is important because by this point, Lauren had already tried to leave multiple times. And by the next afternoon, she was dead. And almost immediately, the story surrounding that night begins simplifying itself. A drunk girl, a tragic fall, a terrible accident. But the deeper you go into the timeline surrounding Lauren's final night, the harder it becomes to understand what actually happened on that cliff. Welcome back, listeners, to Dark Dialogue Distilled. This is the series where we strip down cases to the underlying structure and examine what actually holds up once the assumptions, simplifications, and narrative shortcuts are removed. Now, in the first episode of this breakdown, we focused primarily on the physical environment surrounding Lauren's death, the cliff, the campsite, the recovery location, and the terrain itself, and the growing number of questions surrounding the official explanation that Lauren simply wandered away from camp and accidentally fell. But in this episode, we need to take a step back and examine something else. The people surrounding Lauren that weekend, the relationships, the social environment, and the increasingly unstable timeline surrounding the final hours of her life. Because one of the biggest misconceptions in this case is the idea that everyone on that cliff was part of some kind of a close-knit friend group. They weren't. Some of the people there barely knew each other or didn't know each other at all. Some relationships inside that environment were already strained before Lauren ever arrived. And by Saturday night, Lauren's documented behavior increasingly points in one direction, away from that cliff, away from that group, and away from WakeFest entirely. This episode is not about forcing a murder theory, and it's not about pretending that any kind of certainty exists where it doesn't. It's about examining why the timeline surrounding Lauren's final night becomes so difficult to stabilize once you start comparing the statements, the movements, and the known behavior surrounding the people that were involved. Because after the last independently confirmed sighting of Lauren alive, almost everything that follows comes from recollections, changing narratives, conflicting statements, and explanations that don't always fit together cleanly. So before we can properly evaluate what may have happened to Lauren Agee, we first need to understand the world that she was moving through during the final weekend of her life. It's very important to understand that Lauren already had a real life waiting for her outside of this weekend. And the tragedy of all of these cases is that everything comes down to whatever they were doing in the last moments of their life. But WakeFest and Center Hill Lake were not Lauren's identity. She had a boyfriend at home. She had friends at home. She had a family at home. She had an entire life outside of WakeFest and Center Hill Lake. And this was the tiniest part of all of that. This wasn't somebody that was arriving and unattached or socially adrift. She had what is described as a very close relationship with her boyfriend, Chase Mitchell. And Chase wasn't able to go to WakeFest that weekend, but he had plans to have some kind of a get together at his house on Saturday night. And Lauren had said that she planned to be back to attend that with him. And their relationship is very important for one main reason, and that is because later narratives would try to insinuate that Lauren was obsessed with her ex-boyfriend, Clint Martin, and had spent most of her time at WakeFest trying to rekindle something with him. But as we dive into this, you're going to see that that is just simply not true. Matter of fact, you'll see evidence that points completely the opposite direction. And so the real question becomes, why are people trying to make it seem as though she was trying to get with Clint? Her and Chase had been dating for quite some time. And from all the accounts that I was able to find, this wasn't a casual relationship. They were really talking about future planning. This was a relationship that was growing and very likely headed somewhere in the future. And another very important point about Chase is that Lauren told him that she was going to be staying in a cabin for the weekend. She also told her mother that. She also would tell friends that. The cabin weekend theme is going to keep reoccurring in this case. And it's fascinating for a few reasons that we're going to be discussing. And it's a detail that matters enormously because it changes the entire psychological framing of that trip. And what she walked into was not a cabin weekend, and it is not what many people later imagined it would be. Now, Hannah Palmer was Lauren's connection into that cliff environment. They had been friends for a long time, but when I interviewed Lauren's sister, Allison, she really described that friendship as having become more of an on again, off again type of friendship, maybe fair weather friends, that kind of a situation.
As far as her relationship with my sister goes, they were kind of your on again, off again friends, kind of seasonal friends, I guess you could say, because they would be friends for a little while and then they would kind of go their separate ways, just other friends, other things going on in life. Hannah would get a boyfriend or vice versa. And then they would come back together and they'd hang out again and then it would kind of ebb and flow. So they were friends for a long time, but I don't think they were like connected at the hip, lifelong, like everyday besties.
Hannah and Lauren were not friends by this point that were hanging around together all of the time. And Lauren's mother, Sherry, had some real reservations about Lauren going on this trip with Hannah. And I think that points to maybe some friction or something occurring in that relationship with Hannah and Lauren over the course of time that made that friendship kind of start to fizzle. And Hannah had recently started dating Aaron Lilly. This was a relatively new relationship. And that WakeFest weekend was going to be kind of their public coming out party as couples. And Aaron's social world increasingly becomes the dominant structure surrounding that campsite and that weekend and everything. And that's important because this is Aaron's social world, not Lauren's. So you can think of Hannah as being effectively Lauren's bridge into that cliff group, into that circle of people that she would be spending the weekend with. And it's important to note that, again, this is not Lauren's group. This is Aaron's group that Hannah has brought Lauren into. But that relationship between Hannah and Aaron really appears even more layered than later retellings would suggest. And once Lauren arrives at WakeFest, the social gravity in the environment increasingly revolves around Aaron Lilly. Now, Chris Stout was another person that was there that weekend, and he was unknown to Lauren before WakeFest. From everything I was able to find, they met each other at WakeFest, and Chris is tied closely to Aaron socially. So Lauren already, as soon as she gets there on Friday, is not entering an environment that she was expecting, and she's not entering an environment that she is familiar with.
She had just started dating Aaron recently, and Chris was a third party to all of this. He was not, according to Hannah, she did not know Chris, and my sister did not know Chris. So when everybody got there for the weekend, Chris joined, and that's when my sister and Hannah both met Chris, supposedly. Now, if Hannah's boyfriend is Aaron, you would think she would know his friends, especially the friends that would be close enough to come hang out with them all weekend. But, I'm not going to assume, but
the campsite quickly starts to look like overlapping social circles with unequal familiarity. Some of these people knew each other very well. They'd known each other their entire lives. And some of them didn't know each other at all, such as Chris and Lauren. And that brings us to another interesting, confusing, mystifying member of that Cliff group, and that's Brix Gambrell. Brix was there with Aaron long before Hannah and Lauren would arrive. He helped Aaron set up the campsite, and he was there for the weekend. But in later retellings, he disappears entirely, which is interesting. And it really becomes one of the earliest signs that the narrative that surrounds this entire Cliff group might have already been simplifying itself very early.
He strikes me as an odd addition to this whole story anyway, with them being so secretive about whether he was up there that night and not. And I don't know, that whole thing just strikes me as super odd.
It is because he was there and he was present that weekend. And I mean, he even made social media posts as well, just like Chris did, about how fabulous their weekend was. So he was there and he was present, but why he has been kept under such wraps, I don't personally know. I know that I've heard rumors and things that, he was up there that night and he was possibly involved in the situation. But if that were to be true, for some reason, he has been very well protected.
It really becomes one of the strangest details in the case, and that is how Brix disappears from almost all of the narratives about that weekend. And now that doesn't prove that he's guilty of anything, but it does suggest that the story surrounding the Cliff may already have been narrowing very early on before the investigation ever even began. So Lauren and Hannah got to WakeFest on Friday evening, and that evening, that group and everybody that was attending WakeFest went to Fish Lips, which is at Pates Ford Marina, right across from the cliff where the group was camping. And that Friday night appears to fundamentally change the entire emotional atmosphere surrounding the cliff. And that is because Aaron's ex-girlfriend, Cassie Franks, is there that night. And she confronts Aaron because Aaron has apparently been keeping in contact with her and carrying on a clandestine relationship with Cassie while he is with Hannah. And Cassie has proof of it. She had the text messages or whatever to prove it. And so Hannah and Cassie end up getting in a fist fight in the parking lot that night, which completely destabilizes that entire environment. Cassie ends up leaving. Another friend of Lauren's is there, and that is Samantha Arnold. And Samantha is the one that had originally invited Lauren to WakeFest, but then had to cancel because they didn't have enough room for Lauren. That's how Lauren ended up going with Hannah. And Samantha had come with Cassie Franks. Well, after the fight, Cassie Franks gets in her car and she leaves, which leaves Samantha stranded there for Friday night. And Samantha ends up going back and spending the night on the cliff with that entire Cliff group and Lauren and everything. So we have public conflict and obvious instability in this relationship between Hannah and Aaron. Everything is kind of blowing up at this point. People are taking sides, and Lauren increasingly is sitting inside an environment that's becoming very socially uncomfortable around her. So they go back to the cliff that night. They spend the night. By all accounts, everything went okay. But you can see how the social dynamic is probably kind of uncomfortable. I think we've all been in situations where, you're with a couple, the couple is fighting, and you're like, okay, this is freaking awkward, and I need to get away from here. And I think that might be what was going on with Lauren. And then you add to that the other dynamic that was happening on that cliff, and that is the sleeping arrangements, which I find is odd. And I wouldn't be surprised if Lauren was feeling like she was a little bit set up, because there was a tent in which Hannah and Aaron were going to be staying. So Lauren is probably not going to be sleeping in that tent with a couple, Hannah and Aaron, which means she's going to have to sleep in the hammock. There's 2 hammocks that are strung between trees right over that 90-foot cliff that looks down over Pates Ford Marina. One would logically think, okay, well, there's 2 hammocks. Chris is going to get one hammock and Lauren's going to take the other hammock, except for the fact that Bricks was there. Even though he doesn't show up in any of the narratives, he's completely washed out of the entire weekend for whatever reason that I can't really explain. But when you're looking at the sleeping arrangements, that detail is extremely important, because if he's there, then he's going to be taking up that other hammock, which means Lauren has no place to sleep except on the ground or share a hammock with a stranger. Now, Bricks wasn't a complete stranger to Lauren like Chris was. They had gone to the same school, and Lauren apparently knew him, but they ran in different circles. They were not friends. And according to Lauren's mom, they really didn't know each other that well. You know, it's just somebody that she went to school with. Now, what the deciding factor was to share a hammock with Chris and instead of Bricks, or I have no idea about that whole dynamic, but Bricks's presence is very important because it removes that second hammock as being a viable option for Lauren, which is something that really bothered me about this story until the whole Bricks situation came up. And then I was like, okay, well, that makes sense. She didn't have any other options. So I think Lauren felt trapped, and it almost reads to me like a kind of a weird setup, and not one that's that unusual in a group of kids that age to think that, okay, we're going to get Chris and Lauren together, so let's set this up so that Lauren has to share a hammock with Chris. I'm not saying that that is what happened. I have no clue what happened. I wasn't there, but I do think it makes sense and it fits. So the entire group goes back after the fish lips fight and incident and chaos. They go back up to the cliff, and it's during that canoe ride back up there that you can hear them kind of joking, and Hannah makes the comment, kind of the tongue-in-cheek joke that they're going into a death trap. There's a cliff on both sides, and they're going into a death trap. But they go up there, they spend Friday night, they get up on Saturday, they do some cliff jumping, they participate in the events of WakeFest, and from all accounts, Saturday was a relatively normal day on the lake. Nothing really stands out about Saturday through the day. It's just a standard day on the lake during a major festival like WakeFest. And then we move into Saturday night. And the more you examine Saturday night, the more Lauren's trusted anchors appear to exist outside of that cliff group. Different people, different environments, and importantly, different exits. And that pattern really becomes impossible to ignore. And by this time, Saturday night, Lauren increasingly appears to be moving in one direction, and that is away from the cliff. And before we can understand why that matters, we have to understand the cliff itself, because the physical environment surrounding that campsite may have shaped far more of this case than people initially realized. So we talked about that cliffside camp spot in the first episode, and we'll be discussing it as we work through this entire case. I'm not going to go through it in extreme detail here, because really the most important thing to understand is Lauren thought that she was going for a cabin weekend, and she arrived there and found this remote cliffside campsite that was accessible pretty much only by canoe, with almost zero communication. Cell phones didn't work up there. The terrain was extraordinarily steep and difficult to maneuver around, and it really limited any kind of independent mobility once she was on that cliff, meaning she couldn't just easily go back to the marina or easily go somewhere else. She kind of was stuck on that cliff. And I'm going to keep coming back to this other point, and that is that going up there that weekend, Lauren believed there was going to be a cabin. Chase Mitchell believed there was going to be a cabin. Sherry, Lauren's mom, believed there was going to be a cabin. And Lauren continues to refer to a cabin throughout this entire weekend, which is interesting because she'll continue to refer to it as a cabin even after Friday night when she's already slept on that clip face. And I don't have a good explanation for that. I just have to wonder if psychologically it made it easier for Lauren to accept what was actually happening. Lauren had a fear of heights, so sleeping at the top of a 90-foot cliff had to at least be uncomfortable for her. And so I think that consistently referring to that spot as a cabin was her way of emotionally dealing with the reality of where they were actually going to be sleeping. Obviously, the word cabin creates a very different mental image than what actually existed on that cliff. And I think psychologically that distinction is really important because once Lauren physically arrived there, the environment became much more isolated than she really realized heading into it. And then the other very important thing about that camp location is the very poor cell signal that they had around the campsite and the lack of any ability to charge the cell phones anyway. It's reported that calls and texts struggled to connect and go through. Communication was inconsistent at best. And Lauren tried multiple times to contact people from the outside world, and those attempts failed, or they attempted to contact her and those attempts failed. So this increases her isolation, very likely her frustration, and without a doubt, her dependence on the people nearby there, which becomes very important once Lauren increasingly wants to get away from WakeFest. She wants a ride out of there. She wants to sleep somewhere different. She wants to go home. So by Saturday night, the cliff was no longer just a campsite. It had become isolated. It had become socially unstable, and it had become very difficult to leave and increasingly disconnected from the safer environments that Lauren appeared to be moving towards earlier in that evening. And that's where the timeline surrounding her final night really starts becoming more uncomfortable, because the next question is no longer what was the cliff. The question becomes, why did Lauren increasingly seem to want to get away from that cliff environment? Lauren spoke to her friend Jade, and she reportedly told Jade that she was not having a good time and could Jade come and get her? And Jade was unable to come and get her, and Jade tried to call Lauren back, but the call would never go through, which brings us back to the poor cell service. But this was, I think, the first attempt of Lauren trying to get away from there. And there isn't any more details about what not having a good time means or what exactly was bothering Lauren. We've talked about some of the things that I suspect for sure: sleeping on a cliff, sharing a hammock with a stranger. All of that, I think, would make most of us feel uncomfortable. So it's not surprising that Lauren wanted out of there. And she also had planned to be home Saturday night to attend Chase's party. And so this call with Jade really becomes one of the clearest direct windows into Lauren's mindset during that final night. She's not excited to be there. She's not wanting to continue the party. She's not wanting to stay longer. She's wanting out. And then at Fish Lips Bar that night, Saturday night, Lauren is spending time with some of her other friends. And that's another interesting dynamic that I think really points to Lauren's mindset is that night at Fish Lips, Lauren is not with the Cliff group for that night. She is drinking and having a good time with other people and almost seems a little bit distant from Aaron and Hannah and Chris, and Bricks is a friggin' mystery throughout this entire story. So, but one of the people that was there that weekend was Teresa Shelton, and she was there with her son, Evan, and Evan and Lauren were really good friends. Teresa was older. She's not the same age group as Lauren. She's really more like a mother figure. She was not drinking heavily. And so Teresa's recollections of that night become extremely important because they're not inhibited by alcohol. And they're coming from an adult perspective, which is definitely different. And Lauren asks if she could stay in Teresa Shelton's RV. And obviously that RV would represent somebody that she trusted and a safe place for her to stay. But she learned that her ex-boyfriend, Clint Martin, and his new girlfriend, Callie, were going to be staying there. And so she backs away from that idea, which is fascinating considering the fact that the narratives from the Cliff group the following day, the very next day, are that Lauren wanted to get back with Clint. Lauren tried to make out with Clint that night. Lauren was chasing Clint. Lauren wouldn't stop talking about Clint, which is interesting because if Lauren wanted to reconnect with Clint, if she had spent the entire weekend fixated on Clint, why would she pass up an opportunity to sleep in the same RV with Clint? That'd be a perfect situation for them to potentially rekindle that lost relationship. But that's not what Lauren does. Instead, as soon as Clint comes into the picture, Lauren backs off and says, no, forget about it. And Clint would later say that Lauren never approached him that weekend. Lauren didn't try to make out with him. So that entire story is just fiction, which is interesting. And I think that Lauren's refusal to then stay in that RV absolutely disproves all of the Clint narratives that are going to be coming out after Lauren is found dead. Now, that doesn't automatically answer anything. It doesn't necessarily prove anything, but I do think that it matters. And then also Saturday night, Samantha Arnold, who had spent Friday night on the cliff because she was stranded, she makes plans to leave with Cassie and go back home because Cassie came back to WakeFest after the Friday incident. She comes back. Samantha's going to go home with her. And Lauren reportedly responds to that news with, quote, "Oh my God, I want to go home too." And so Samantha offers her a ride and Lauren accepts that ride. And she says that she just has to go and tell Hannah that she's taken off, but she ends up never returning. Now, we don't know why, and I'm not insinuating that there's anything sinister about her not returning. Who the hell knows what happened? But it is interesting that she wants out and she wants that ride and she wants to go home. And that quote is not like a, gosh, I don't know if I should leave or if I should stay. I'm really torn. Oh my God, I want to go home is very clear about where Lauren's mindset was by Friday night. This entire encounter with Samantha, I think, really is one of the most important behavioral sequences of the weekend because it doesn't point to some kind of vague unhappiness. This is Lauren actively attempting to leave and stating, frankly, that she wants to go home. So we don't really know what happened between her telling Samantha, oh my God, I want to go home too, and not returning. But we do know that somewhere between that conversation and Lauren returning back to the Cliff group, that exit disappears. And then Aaron Lilly would later state that Lauren said that she wanted to go home numerous times that weekend. And remember, we're only talking about Friday night into Saturday. So we're not talking about an entire weekend. We're talking about essentially one day. So it seems like Lauren wanted to go home almost immediately. And Aaron would say, quote, "Me and Hannah obviously weren't going to let that happen. And so they took her keys and they hid them behind a tree." And they said they did that because she was drinking, which is understandable and is something that a lot of us have done in similar situations to prevent somebody from driving after drinking. But this really becomes a very important statement. And not because taking those keys means anything bad, but because it confirms that Lauren repeatedly wanted to leave. She wanted to go home. And this is Aaron Lilly himself that is saying this. And so now the pattern exists across multiple independent interactions, from Jade to Samantha to Teresa and Evan Shelton. And now even Aaron and Hannah are saying that Lauren wanted to go home. And so once you see that pattern, it really becomes difficult to unsee. So by late Saturday night into early Sunday morning, most, if not all, of Lauren's apparent exits from that environment have collapsed. Different opportunities for rides have disappeared. Alternative sleeping arrangements have disappeared. Communication remains totally unreliable on the cliff. And socially, that group itself becomes increasingly dominant again. So the more that we examine Saturday night, the harder it becomes to view Lauren as somebody that was settled into that environment at all. Because behaviorally, she increasingly appears to be trying to get the hell out of there. And that changes the emotional structure of everything that happens afterwards. So by the time Lauren Agee was the last independently confirmed to be alive, there were already major fractures in the narrative surrounding that night. Because now the case contains a socially unstable environment, repeated attempts to leave, repeatedly stating she wanted to go home, and collapsing exit routes in a group whose later accounts do not align cleanly with one another. And so once investigators began trying to reconstruct the actual timeline after the marina closes, the certainty surrounding the case starts to break apart almost immediately. So off-duty White County Sheriff's Sergeant Chris Yarchuk was working security for WakeFest that weekend. And him and who would become known as the Houseboat People are really the final independently confirmed sightings of Lauren Agee alive. Almost everything that follows them leaving Fish Lips Bar early Sunday morning around 2 a.m. comes from later recollections, conflicting statements, reconstructed memory, and narratives that do not fit together cleanly. And the deeper that we examine those timelines, the harder they become to stabilize. Because after that marina closes, the timeline stops being built around any kind of independently confirmed observations and starts being built entirely around statements. So her and that group walking out of Fish Lips and speaking to Chris Yarchuk, they actually asked him for a cigarette, becomes a very important matter because it's tied to something external. It's tied to the bar closing. It's tied to interactions with an off-duty officer who is working that weekend as security. So he's not drinking, and part of his job is observing people. That becomes very important. But after this point, the timeline loses any kind of structure immediately. After they leave, there's no independent sightings, there's no verified timestamps, and the timeline now depends completely on statements. And reconstructed timelines are often much messier than people would expect, especially after nights involving drinking and emotional conflict and stress. And it becomes very interesting because even among the statements that were given, they can't even decide on when they left the bar, because Aaron would state that they were back up on the cliff by around midnight, which doesn't make any sense at all because they closed the bar down. And I really struggle to reconcile that discrepancy because even after a night of drinking, you typically remember closing a bar down. I find it highly unusual that Aaron would think that they were back up on the cliff by midnight. But we'll be breaking that all down when we go through the timeline in detail. It's just important to note now because it really displays how unreliable memory or recollection or whatever the hell this is. Because from midnight to 2 a.m. is not a minor memory drift. The problem is the entire sequence appears to shift. The timeline doesn't just become fuzzy. At points, it becomes structurally impossible to reconcile. Certain sequences simply cannot fit cleanly with independently anchored events. Now, what really happened that night? Because multiple different versions have emerged. Some of the versions say that Lauren stayed at the campsite. Other versions say she left briefly and then later returned. Other versions say she left to go find Clint. Some versions have her in the hammock and other versions have her leaving. They're all over the place. And this is just in the official statements. Because Aaron would say, Lauren I saw last when we were coming back from the bar with our group. she had cried about her ex-boy who I saw the next morning, and he said she tried to make a move on him and he refused. Said we last saw her going to a houseboat. She was last seen by me, I would say midnight, before Hannah and I got to bed in our tent at the campsite. That was the official statement given by Aaron Lilly on the day that Lauren's body was found. Now, what does Hannah have to say? Hannah says, last night we were at Patesford Marina. We got in the canoe to go home, the cliff. We got to the top and all went to lay down for bed. Me and Aaron were in the tent. Lauren and Chris were in the hammock. When we woke up this morning, Lauren was gone, but all of her stuff was still on the campsite. We thought she might be at WakeFest, but she wasn't there. We immediately went to the campsite. When coming back to the dock, she wasn't up there still, but her stuff was. I went to see if she might have been at the Pates Ford bar, and I saw that policemen were headed to our campsite area. That is Hannah Palmer's official statement given on the day that Lauren's body was found. And then finally, what does Chris Stout have to say about what happened that night? Chris Stout's statement is probably one of the most mystifying statements of the three. He says, last night, the girl came to our campsite for a few minutes saying she was going back to her ex-boyfriend, hung out very shortly. Then I fell asleep and woke up and she was gone. Talked to her ex this morning and he said she came back after we left and was trying to get with him the night after we seen her at campsite. Said she was trying to make out with him in front of his new girlfriend. Then he walked away. And that is Chris Stout's entire official police statement. So you can see that even among these accounts, things differ tremendously. Nobody's telling the same story, which is interesting because even if you're extraordinarily drunk, even if you've been drinking all day at the lake like these kids had, there's things that you don't remember for sure, but you don't just randomly make up memories. So as you can see, the problem is not just one tiny inconsistency. It's that the structure itself keeps changing depending on which account you're looking at. And eventually, the timeline starts feeling less like one sequence and more like competing reconstructions that don't fit together in any logical way. And from those statements and later recordings and interviews and such, you can see multiple claims that Lauren wanted Clint. But Clint denies any major interaction with Lauren that weekend at all. You could see from the official statements that both Aaron and Chris claim that Clint told them Lauren tried to make out with him, but Clint would later say that that never happened at all, which is extremely interesting if you're telling a true story. And then we have the situation where Lauren avoids sleeping in the RV because Clint and Callie were going to be there. So there is absolutely zero evidence of any attempt on Lauren's part to reconnect with Clint that weekend. The only place that comes up is in the narratives told after her death, after she's not there to set the record straight. And it's important because the whole Lauren is chasing Clint explanation increasingly becomes one of the emotional foundations that was used to explain her movements, her absence from the camp, why they weren't concerned, their emotional behavior. But really, that explanation weakens significantly when you really start looking at it. The further that we examine Lauren's actual behavior, the harder that the simplified she was chasing Clint narrative becomes to cleanly sustain. Now, that doesn't mean that emotions weren't involved. It means that the behavior becomes much more complicated and much easier to define than the later shorthand explanation. And then we have the Chris Stout problem. Chris is described as being highly intoxicated to the point that he was completely incapacitated. Yet later accounts rely very heavily on Chris allegedly knowing that Lauren left the hammock. So you're either passed out drunk or you're awake enough to know that she left the hammock, but those two things cannot both be true at the same time. And this really becomes a very uncomfortable portion of the timeline, because if Chris was so heavily incapacitated that he was passed out drunk, then his observational reliability becomes impossible to assess. And a lot of the timeline ultimately depends on observations that are attributed to somebody who is remembering the event while simultaneously being described as heavily impaired or totally passed out. And analytically, that creates some obvious reliability questions, not necessarily malicious ones, but real ones. Before we keep going, I want to take a second to talk about something that matters beyond the episode itself. At Dark Dialogue, we've built something called the Adopt a Victim program. The goal is simple: to keep attention on the victims themselves, not just the case, and find answers for those stories without them. Because once the headlines fade, most people are forgotten. This is one way to make sure that that doesn't happen. If that's something that you want to be a part of, you can find it on the website along with the rest of the Dark Dialogue network. All right, so let's get back into this. And then we have the canoe problem, because if Lauren leaves that cliff independently to go try to hook up with Clint or whatever else she was going to do, then the canoe should have been gone. But all of the campers attest to the fact that the canoe was there that morning. They used it that morning to go cliff jumping. So that really makes the movement mechanics very difficult. And this is where the physical environment really starts colliding directly with the timeline reconstruction, because the geography keeps re-entering the timeline. Movement on and off of that cliff was not simple. It required a boat or swimming across to the marina. And when you try to reconstruct how Lauren supposedly moved through the environment at dark, overnight, barefoot, without taking the canoe, the logistics really start becoming more difficult. Eventually, the question stops becoming which version is correct, and it starts becoming, why is the sequence itself so difficult to stabilize if it's true? Because by the time investigators try reconstructing Lauren's final movements, the timeline is already breaking apart. And so really what investigators had after the discovery of Lauren's body, and what should have raised some very serious red flags for them, is they had Lauren's body, they had a cliff, they had a socially unstable environment, and they had a timeline that resisted any kind of coherence. And once the sequence surrounding Lauren's final night started to collapse, the official explanation itself becomes much harder to evaluate cleanly, because now the question isn't just what happened to Lauren Agee, it becomes how much of the story surrounding that night was ever truly stable to begin with. Lauren's case continues haunting people, not simply because Lauren died, but because the story surrounding her final night never made any sense, and it was completely unstable. The social dynamics, the environment, the conflicting recollections, and the physical realities of the cliff all continue resisting one clean explanation. And once uncertainty becomes embedded that deeply into a case, it rarely disappears. And one of the most important things to understand about Lauren Taylor Agee's case is that doubt did not emerge years later through internet conspiracy culture. The instability was already there almost immediately, because from the beginning, the timeline, the environment, and the social dynamics surrounding her final night never fully settled into any kind of coherent story. At a surface level, the case sounds very simple. A group of young people were out drinking in dangerous terrain. And initially, that explanation understandably made sense to a lot of people, but the case never fully fits cleanly. And the discomfort surrounding this case comes less from one giant smoking gun and more from accumulated friction, a timeline that won't stabilize, behavior that doesn't align, environmental realities that complicate the movement, and a social sequence that increasingly feels unstable. Human beings naturally simplify unstable events after the fact, especially traumatic ones. And over time, the Lauren Agee narrative increasingly compresses itself into something that's emotionally easier to process. The cliff and that entire environment up there never leaves this case. And every attempt to reconstruct Lauren's final movements eventually collides with that environment again. The terrain itself keeps reintroducing uncertainty. And the danger in cases like this is that eventually the mystery starts to replace the person. Lauren Agee becomes the cliff case, the timeline case, the theory case. And somewhere underneath all of that was a 21-year-old woman who should have gotten to leave that lake alive. Lauren's case remains one of the most emotionally and analytically unstable death investigations that I've looked into. And not because every answer is hidden, and not because every theory is correct, but because the story surrounding Lauren's final night never fully settled into something coherent enough for many people to emotionally accept. A young woman arrived at WakeFest expecting a summer lake weekend. By Saturday night, she increasingly appeared to want away from the environment that was surrounding her. And by the next afternoon, Lauren was found dead. Now, before we close this episode, there's something else that I want to say. One of the things that sets Dark Dialogue apart, for me at least, especially on the main show in Rocky Mountain Reckoning, has been the victim tributes. Because after hours spent inside of evidence and timelines and contradictions and investigative analysis, I never want the final thing that listeners carry away to just be the mystery. I want them to remember the person. And the more that Distilled has evolved, the more I've realized that these cases need that too. Because it's very easy in analytical formats to slowly reduce someone's life down to diagrams and theories and movement patterns and forensic discussion. But Lauren Agee was more than the instability surrounding her final night. She was more than the cliff. She was more than the timeline. She was more than the unanswered questions. So from this point forward, Distilled will end in the same way that the other Dark Dialogue shows do, by bringing the focus back to where it belongs, to the victim. This is Angel Wings by the J.J. Hawk Band. And this is Lauren Taylor Agee. One of the hardest things about cases like Lauren Agee's is how quickly the person disappears beneath the instability, the timeline, the contradictions, the cliff, the theories, the arguments. Eventually, people stop talking about Lauren like she was a person, and they start talking about her like a problem that needs to be solved. But before any of this became an investigation or a timeline debate or one of Tennessee's most emotionally contested death cases, Lauren Agee was just a 21-year-old woman trying to live her life. She was a daughter, a friend, a sister, a young woman with people waiting for her to come home. And I think that's important because somewhere along the way, the mythology surrounding the cliff started becoming larger than Lauren herself. The internet has turned the case into diagrams and arguments and screenshots and theories and injury analysis and endless reconstruction. And I'm part of that too. And it's important because this case needs answers. But underneath all of that, there was still a real person here. A young woman who thought she was going to spend a summer weekend at the lake. And what makes this case linger emotionally, I think, for so many people, is that Lauren increasingly appears to spend huge portions of that final night trying to move back toward safety, back toward familiarity, back toward home. And somehow, she never gets there. There's something uniquely haunting about unfinished exits. The phone call that almost connected, the ride that almost happened, the plan that almost worked, the moment somebody was almost out of an environment that no longer felt right to them. And I think that's part of why Lauren's case still affects people so deeply, because emotionally, it feels like she was close to leaving, close to getting out, close to making it home. And then the timeline disappears. The cliff takes over the story, and uncertainty moves into the space where answers should have been. But Lauren Taylor Agee was never supposed to become the cliff case. She was supposed to keep living, keep laughing with friends, keep building a future beyond a single weekend in the summer of 2015. And maybe that's the real tragedy underneath all of this. Not just the unanswered questions, not just the instability, but the future that never got the chance to exist after that weekend ended.